Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. Can you give me a quick chat if you can hear me? Excellent. I see chats coming in. You can hear me loud and clear. Excellent. Thanks for joining us today. We're excited to kick things off. It looks like everyone has already found the chat box, but just as a quick reminder, we will use the chat box to moderate your questions during today's presentation. If your question is not answered during today's presentation, we'll be sure to read those in a moderated fashion at the end of the presentation. So at this time, I'll pass it over to your presenter. Nirav, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes, I'm right here.
Excellent.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. Welcome everybody to Database Migration 101. I'm going to share my screen. I hope everybody's doing well. I see there's participants from different countries. I'm surprised I don't know anybody, but I'm excited to give this presentation. Let me give you a little bit of background on myself. My name is Nirav Assar. I joined the Grails team about a year ago, and I'm working with companies doing Grails, and I'm enjoying it. So one of my passions at my previous clients was database migration, and I found this quite interesting because it's something that's necessary in development. It clears up a lot of mud, and we use this solution. It's a database migration solution with Grails, and I thought I'd share it with you guys. So some of my past experiences, I worked at some clients, the financial industry, retail domain, and those domains change a lot. And what that means is the database is updated constantly with new domains, new entities, new concepts. And a lot of times companies have different segments that work on. Developers work on the application. Database developers work on the database. And there's a lot of churning going back and forth, and communication and is necessary to make changes. The database migration, streamlining it helps a lot. So with that, I'll begin with the presentation. First, I wanted to define the database migration. I believe the term, which is widely used in our industry, even though it's known, it can be misinterpreted. So there's some confusing interpretations. For example, I've heard that database migration may mean we're moving the database to another location. It also may mean we're replicating it. It may mean that we are changing centers, or we're switching out the server, or we're changing database names. I find this a bit confusing. So I'd like to define the definition of database migration. And I have it written down here in my notes. I'll orally transcribe it. It's basically the management of database schema changes on an application while preserving the existing data, adding structure and process to database changes. Some things that this is useful for is tracking change log data movements. And this is basically the evolution of your database with software changes. It really doesn't have anything to do with copying data somewhere else, or changing your server, or changing database hubs. And without this process, teams may resort to ad hoc approaches. Some of these things I've seen is taking SQL files and dumping them on a file folder, and people just managing that way. There's a lot of emails going back and forth saying, hey, we're about to do this database change. Can we shut down the application so we can do it at night so it doesn't disturb anybody? And these processes work, but they are ad hoc and they have their risks. So, and with Grails, we're using Gorm and Hibernate. And the default that comes with it would be, if you look here, the DB create option. I'm sure if you're a Grails developer, you'd be familiar with that. With that, it has problems. As I wrote here, there's dangers in just using update. Usually in a forum, I would go back and forth and ask you guys. You're welcome to do that in the chat. But let me go over some of the dangers that I've encountered. If you use the default, it can work, but you have to have the assumption that the database changes will not be destructive, or let me say interruptive. It may not be vastly changing, and this limits refactoring. So you can have the assumption to have update and make it work. But once you start massaging the database, ripping it apart, changing a domain, changing the concepts of the application, which many applications do as they evolve, you run into problems. With update, basic changes like adding columns, creating a new table that's totally separate, those work. Update and Hibernate will do that for you. However, if you want to delete a column, let's say, for example, you take out a attribute of a domain and you expect that column to be deleted. That does not fall under what Hibernate Update does. You cannot change the database type. It doesn't automatically do that. And when objects change and you need data to move from one table to another, it won't help you with that either. Also with constraints, this is some of the limitations. So we'll go through these. Some of those examples I have that I've mentioned will be demonstrated in our hands-on coding and kind of the demo I'm doing today. So let me set out the agenda for us. We'll learn how to use the Grails Database Migration plugin. I will do some live coding examples. The plugin is based on Liquibase, if you haven't known already. And this is an open source tool. It's Java-based. And with the Grails Database Migration plugin, it is wrapped around Liquibase. So Liquibase is the fundamental technology underneath. And in its statement, it's for tracking, managing, and applying database schema changes. Just a little background: to start in 2006, and people use it all over. It doesn't have to be a Grails application, Java applications, even other technologies use it. They specifically will adopt a Java module to implement Liquibase. Now, a little bit of just being upfront here. I haven't used Liquibase in its pure form, but I've used the tool extensively on Grails. A funny story is we were using Grails, and a Liquibase consulting company came in and said, hey, we need to use this tool. And I spent about a day explaining to them that the database migration plugin was wrapped around Liquibase, and we could probably do 90% of the things the vendor tool did, and they had an enterprise Liquibase tool. So, to me, it would have been pointless to implement Liquibase on top of Grails and database migration. You probably would have ripped out some of the seamless processes that were put in place to use the plugin inside Grails. Okay, and through the presentation, we'll do discussion of fundamental concepts. I'll have a little bit of discussion on what goes where and how to think about it. And I hope to achieve the following. We'll baseline a database, meaning that we'll start an application with the Liquibase plugin, the database migration plugin. And a couple examples we'll go through is we'll change a column to nullable. We'll start off very simple. We'll add columns to a table, and then we'll go through a mildly more complex redesign a table from some table being table A, which in my example I have as a person, and it will turn into a person and address table. So let me get into the sample application. I don't have it loaded yet. I do have the code. So once we get the application started, we'll have the UI. And so let me just give you a rundown of what my application is. It's very simple. I have a MySQL installation. We could go with an H2, which is an in-memory database, but I think a more real-life scenario would be MySQL. So I have that installed locally, and I have a MySQL client. And we'll use that client to show how the database is changing. We'll do it from the command line. My application will have a person, and that person is an object in the database, and it has address information. We'll evolve it. We'll slowly go from name and age, add in a street and address and zip code. And I'm not focusing on UI here, so I'm going to use the scaffolding mechanisms in Grails. And I've dumbed this down because we have a short amount of time. And so I'm starting out with a already created application, and we're going to go directly into the examples. Previously in different presentations at a conference or at a user group, I would do it hands-on coding and go up. It's more interactive that way. However, we're limited because it's a webinar. I hope that's okay with everybody. Nikki, how's the chat going? I'm not showing my chat very well. Did you want me to pause for any questions? I'm not following it.
Sure. So Sergio has actually been manning the chat.
Okay.
And it looks like we're in good shape for the moment.
Okay. Flag me down if this is a good time to ask questions before we actually get into it, and then maybe some of the questions will be detailed once we get into it. All right. So here's my application. All right, I'll go over some of the areas which I just talked about. As we can see here, we'll start from the UI. I don't have much at all, and the controllers have just got a couple controllers, person controller, and an address. It's just the default. And we're going to start off with the person object. And as I mentioned, it's going to be managed by Gorm, just the name and age, and nothing else. And I've got these files here to avoid for me typing and making it miserable for people to watch my mistakes. But I'll use those as templates. Now let's get into some of the areas of configuration that are applicable to our database migration plugin. Let's start with the build.gradle. Okay, and I've highlighted here, when using the plugin, you'll have to adjust the classback dependency. And then some of the configurations that are applicable to the database and Liquibase, of course, you see here highlighted the core Liquibase jar here. You've got the database migration plugin, of course, your MySQL connector. And right here is what is required. It's all in the database migration plugin documentation is the source sets. So it's not present here in the folder structure, but once we start running the plugin, you'll see a folder called migrations. And this clause enclosure will pick up the files that are dumped in there. It's called the changelog.groovy. Let's go to the application YML. In this one you see here, I've configured a local host of a DB migration, and I've also configured some of the plugin attributes that we need. And I can go through those right now. I think it's appropriate. Update on start means that the plugin is tied into update. On start. So it will start doing its magic when you do a run app or when you deploy a war to a Tomcat server. And as you can see here, the changelog groovy is the directive file which will give the plugin directions on how you're managing the database. Now let's go back to this wonderful item, DB create, which I had kind of chastised early on. DB create used to be update, or it could be create drop. If you see here on the test, it's update. Now, once you create an application, it's going to either be create drop or update. Right here, we have the development environment, but in production or wherever you're working, it should be none on when you're using a database migration plugin. Now, the key concept to that is Grails is no longer Hibernate and Grails out of default is no longer managing the database. So we are going to start delegating the database management to our database migration plugin. And that's key. If you start using a plugin and you have DB create as update or validate or create drop, which is probably the worst, you're going to see problems. You're going to see some unsolicited problems that maybe I couldn't even answer why it's happening. Okay. And I just have a jot here about the controller. Let me go over the bootstrap. So when we get in, very, very quickly, we'll have 3 entries. And it's 3 people, including myself. I've revealed the ages of us. We're getting old. And that's it right now. And we're going to evolve this to add addresses and so on. Okay. Next slide. I've shown you the dependencies and compile dependencies and the source sets. So now let's start with the application. Let's start putting it in action. Now it's going to manage the structure of the changes. That's what we expect. That's what we've configured it to. And it will automate the incremental changes, and it will also track them. And I will demonstrate that. Now, doing this automation gives a little bit of benefit, a lot of benefit, I would say. This makes things repeatable and trackable, so you know who did what to what database. The database migration plugin will create something called a database changelog, and that will have in there the timestamp, the entry that's in the changelog.groovy. It will be inserted into a database change log table, and you'll see the timestamp, and you'll see exactly where that was run and on what table. And what's very beneficial is this can be repeated on local. It can be repeated on a test environment. And so often when you're developing and changing the database around, you may want to just clear your database, wipe it out, and start over with your schema changes. In that case, you may ask, well, what about all of our data? Well, locally developing, you may keep a dump of your database somewhere or in a DDL file or create file SQL. And then you repeatedly apply these changes over and over and over again. Now, if you can imagine what I mentioned about the ad hoc approaches, you may have SQL files dumped everywhere. You don't have an order to those unless you just got the date timestamp or you're manually tracking those. This is a lot of things that the migration plugin does for you. And it's simply on startup or using the migration command line commands. So that's some of the conceptual background here. So let's talk about the workflow, and then I'll get into it. So a workflow that's commonly defined, I think it's even in the plugin, but I think I've added my own little sprinkle to it. We want to baseline the database first. So we're going to define the state of the domain. That means your beginning state of your application, and we'll create a database from that. And this is from the ground up. And we'll set configuration options in the application to use the database migration plugin. I've already shown you that. So let's show that right here. Now you can see here I've got a command line client. The databases that I have locally, the one in particular is DB migration. Now you'll see here I've shown the tables. It's an empty set. We don't have anything yet. Okay. So, and I've turned my Hibernate off, and I'm going to rely on the DB migration plugin to create the table for me. Okay, and I'll show you how to do that. Now, after we've baselined the plugin, we'll start developing, and this is not what I'm going to demonstrate straight off. This will be in the second and third examples. We'll make changes to the domain objects, and then we'll use the changes to generate change logs, and we'll manage the evolution of the domain that way. Okay. Okay, just like any plugin, it comes with command line interfaces based on scripts. So we'll start the first one. What we'll do is we'll baseline the database, and it will expect us to create a person table. So what we'll do here is we'll run the dbm generate GORM changelog. Changelog.groovy. And this doesn't really do anything to the database, it generates the changelog. And right now I'm running from the command line. You see it's churning. Conceptually, what it's doing is it is scanning my domain, it is scanning my database and finding the delta and then creating instructions to update the database and putting it in a file. Okay. Now, you might have seen there that come up, that was just a site mesh error. We can ignore that. If you look at the migrations folder, what we have here is what was generated from that command. And you can see that it wants to create a table with columns. And it's giving it's giving a primary key. It's giving 2 columns, name and age, and also the version column. Now, let me show you good practice. A good practice here is to, every time you make a change, delegate that to its own file and include it in the changelog. And this is purely just a design / easy way to read type action. So I'm going to do that. And another good practice is to name your file to resemble what you're trying to do. And this is just creating a person table. So I've done that, and I will include that in this file. Okay. So now, again, let's note that I haven't done anything to my database, right? I need to kind of instantiate it. So I'll go ahead and do that. And the command is dbn update. And let's ask a question. What do we expect to see here? Okay, we expect to see the tables. And now we have the database changelog. There's a lock table, which prevents erase conditions on accessing the database or doing schema updates at the same time. So we have the person table already created. And as you can see here, we'll describe it. Okay, and we have a table. And now our database is created and we can run the application, and now we can see it live. I'll show you that. Do we have any questions?
I don't see any questions in the chat box just yet, but if you have questions, please type them in to the chat and I'll read them out loud as we go.
All right, so we have our person, and we have 3 entries in there that came from the bootstrap. All right, let's go to the next examples, example 2 and 3. Now let's focus on, we've done the baseline. That was what was here. Now we're going to focus on the development workflow. We'll make changes to domain objects and we'll use the plugin and we'll update the database and we'll continue. Now I've already noted these, it's in the presentation. We've extracted it to break it into pieces. We generated the changelog and I've already noted these 2 tables. Now these are information tables, they're not actually domain tables. All right, so example, let's make one of the columns nullable. So that would be quite simple. Let me kill my server. Let's go to the person object. And if we see here, back to the presentation, all we're doing is taking from name and age and making it nullable. As we can see here, it is not nullable right now. We want to make this to be yes. So what I'm simply going to do is I'm going to add a constraint to the domain object. Okay, and then what I'll do is I will run the command again, and I'm going to start using update on start, which is that entry in application YML right here. Before I use dbm update, I'm going to use it on the run of the war file. The reason I prefer this is because it does exactly what it's going to do in my test or production environment. So I'd like to replicate that as much as I can in an environment that allows me to. And we're in development right now, and I can get to close to what we're going to see when I deploy. So
we do have a couple questions here, Nirav. Is now a good time to read them?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so one question that we have is, I've recently moved to Grails 3.3.3. Whenever I run Grails, dbm generate gorm changelog, it generates statements to create everything as if I do not already have a schema.
Okay.
Is that something you can address here, or should we wait?
I can address it afterwards, but there is, it's basically you want to synchronize your database to your changelog to your existing database. So that's an enterprise scenario where you have an existing database and you want to institute the DB migration plugin, if I'm not wrong. If that's the case, then I do have some thoughts towards that.
Okay, and the next question is, are there any special considerations for other database systems such as MS SQL or PGSQL? Or does it function more or less the same with any Hibernate supported database management system?
I'm not sure if it functions the exact same. My experience is with relational databases. So I could give you this answer that if it functions pretty much the same with the mainstream RDMS databases. Because Hibernate I know supports, I think it supports more than just relational databases. So I'm not sure how this would work.
Okay, thanks. Those are all the questions for right now.
All right, so we'll do dbm. So the command here is going to be dbm gorm diff, and I'm going to use a parameter, which is quite handy, and we're going to call this change age constraint to nullable. Okay, and we're going to say -add. And And what this will do is it will add the include for me, and it will create a separate file so I don't have to do that copy thing that I did last time. So what it's doing conceptually is looking at my database, looking at my domain, finding the differences, and generating a file. And we're not going to put that in the database until we run on startup. Okay, change constraint to nullable. We have here the generated command, and this is Liquibase giving its declarative way, and underneath it's going to run an alter command to the database. If you see here on the changelog, we have added a new include. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to run app, and it will update on start, and you'll see the changes in the logs here. As you see, before it's done, we have not done anything to the database. So now we have a person. It's still here, but we can look at the constraint. Uh-oh. What has happened? Okay. Let's try DBM update. All right, let's see if that had taken effect. There we go. Now I'm not sure why the update on start didn't work. That's probably one of 100 times that it has not worked. If you play with it again and again, it usually works. You want to make sure that update on start will work. It's pretty reliable, but DBM update, it may be something in the plugin that is not catching it if you're toggling these things back and forth. But anyway, we'll try it again on the next one. But you see here that the null is now yes on here on our application. And if I run the application again, we'll be able to come here and you won't show anything, but you will be able to add a person without an age because it's now nullable. Let's go to the next. I'll come back to that UI while we wait. Now the next example, we're just going to add other columns, and this is straightforward. So what we'll do is we'll add street name, city, and zip code, and we have to make them nullable. This is a common thing, because if you don't make them nullable, then you've got to adjust your other previous entries that never had information and put dummy data in there. So that's one of the kind of gotchas that you'll discover if you're into this in the day-to-day. Okay, so now we can add a person in here, and it doesn't have to be an age. Let's go to the example. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add different attributes, and we're going to use the plugin to manage the addition for it. So I've added street name, city, and zip code, and they are all nullable. And I'm going to go in here, and I'm going to run the same command again. I'm going to add another file, dbm change gorm, and I'm going to say add address fields. Okay. And I'm going to try the update on start again afterwards. Okay, so let's check our migrations folder. We've got the add address fields. You can see here that it has caught that there's a diff in city, street name, and zip code. And you can see that's added to the plugin. Sorry, added to the changelog Groovy. And so we've got a separate entry here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and run app, and let's see if this will work. Remember, that comes from the update on start right here. And one of the advantages this feature gave me in previous clients is I didn't have to rely on any type of database support when we deploy the new application. It would just run in between it. So that saved a lot of time, especially if you're in an enterprise company that has resources that need to plan things and take time off and be with you on your deployment. And you get more of a continuous deployment feel. Okay. Not sure what's going on here. Okay. The update on start doesn't seem to be working. Maybe it's a connection issue. It's pretty reliable, but not today. But anyway, we have the columns added to our database. Let's run it and let's put in some data. And I'll show you that, and then I'm going to get into the final, most interesting example here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and add some attributes here. So we've got myself. Let's put a street name. Okay, so now this next example, what we're going to do is we're going to split the domain into two tables, a person and address, and we're going to put a one-to-many relationship in there. And this is a little different because we're redesigning it. We are redesigning the application, and it's pretty destructive of what's there. We're kind of ripping it apart and putting it in two different places. So one of the concerns is we have to migrate the data from one table to the next. So the stuff that is in the person table is going to end up in your address table. Now, nobody knows this except the developers. The tool can't know it. It can't read something and diff it and say, well, this data is from here, because it's all semantics. So you have to give the instructions to move data from one area to the next. And that's the interesting part. And what's happening here is you have some redesign concerns, and I've listed them out. Now this is concerned with the definition of the schema will change, right? You're actually adding another table. And number two is what I highlighted on. Existing data in the table have to be split between two new database tables created. And what we have to do is you have to write some custom SQL and put it in the changelog. And our knowledge is needed there. So what we're doing here is we are taking the person table, splitting it up, and now the benefit of this is if a person has many addresses, we can give it another address. So we're not actually going to do that, but we're setting ourselves up to do that. So let's go into the example. Okay, so what I've done here is I'll take the person and I'll make it has many with a address. See that we don't have an address yet. So what I'll do is I'll take a template here and I'll make myself an address.
Nirav, we had a comment and it said, I wasn't here for the start of the broadcast and can't see higher in the file, but is on start failing because the Grails namespace is commented out in the application.
Grails namespace? Ah, brilliant. Who did that for me?
That was Chuck. Thank you, Chuck.
Nice. I came in here and I uncommented, try to get ready. So let's demonstrate that next. I appreciate that. That's probably it. I'm a dummy. Thank you. Guess I can give this guy a clapping thing on one of those chats if I could find it.
I don't know if we can do the emojis in here. I'll try to find it. Nice work.
All right. So I have address and controller. The address and the controller. We have a person and an address, a one-to-many, right? And so what we need to do is do the create gorm diff again. So we'll do that. Or dbm gorm diff, sorry. So what we'll do here, we'll call it, I'll just be simple. I'll say create address table. It's basically a design, but redesign. But we are creating address table. So we'll go ahead and do that. And I'm going to be bracing for this migrate data area where we are changing, we are taking the data from one table to the next. Okay, so we create an address table. Let's take a look at this file. What this has done, it's done a gorm diff. It's scanned database and application and showed us the differences. So one of the differences, of course, a address table, which is here. Okay, so we're creating it. Then we are dropping columns from a person table. Okay, and we're adding the foreign key constraint in between. Now, what's going on is we're missing something. We're missing the migration of the data, right? And so if I go to this slide here, we need to analyze the change set. It's good to do that. Know what's going on. And we've seen it's necessary to migrate the data. As I mentioned, only you have the knowledge to do this because you're the one changing the domain. Now, Liquidbase helps you organize. It doesn't have all the answers. You got to use your noggin a little bit. And what we can come here is a conclusion of this migration's got to happen before you delete something. So, and then you need to have the address table. So it's going to have to happen after you create the address table, but before you drop the columns. So we'll do that. I've already got this canned stuff, so I don't make mistakes, but that would be here on line 29. We've already created the address table. We've added a foreign key. Now we're going to drop it. Before we drop, we're going to basically insert into address a select statement from the person table. Okay. So if you see here in our table, we don't have anything yet. Sorry, we'll do show tables. We don't have a person table. So what we'll do is we'll try to do the magic here. Maybe we'll do the update on start here. Let's see if that works. I'll be really happy if it does. Okay, this is what we were missing before because of the error. You'll see here, you're doing the same thing DBM update's doing, but on the run war. So now it's applying these change log entries. These are one per the changelog file, those lines. So if you see here, it's complete, it looks great. Let's check if we're right. You go to the person table now, our person table is connected to a one-to-many on an address. And you see here we have migrated the data to this address table. And we have a link there. So we can show tables here. We have an address and a person, and we can describe address for us. And as you can see, I've created those columns and I've migrated the data to those columns. And I just have a quick review. You make changes to domain objects, you generate the changelog, you consider any data to migrate. In the last example, we did have data, and you execute the migration scripts. You do that either on update on start, or you can do on DBM update. And that's my examples, and I'll make these announcements here, and then we'll get to questions. I have a more detailed guide posted to Grails Guides, and this takes you from a blank application all the way through. Some of these examples are included. In the guide, I've also highlighted some of the more enterprise examples, and that's, I think, is one question related. And I believe to answer that question, there's a command, dbm synchronize changelog, something like that. And what that will do, it will say, you're basically telling the plugin, look, I already have tables. I want to make my changelog look like those tables, but I don't want to execute them. And so it will update the database changelog table to say already executed. So you're not repeatedly generating these things. It understands that the diff, you want to consider those differences as kind of in the middle of your project. And so they will resolve them. And then you can move on. When you develop them, the Gorm diff will do it appropriately. So that's the best I can answer your question without kind of researching with you, but I'm glad to do that offline. We have a Grails guide. It's more comprehensive. It has a great list of numerous technologies that you can integrate Grails with and gives you tips. That's under grailsguide.org. And just to make an announcement, these webinars keep going, and we like to offer them. The next one is April 20th, Gorm and GraphQL, and we're excited about that. And register online at the address. And that's all I have for now. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thanks, Nirav. We do have one question, and that is, can this be implemented if you already have an application in production? If so, is there documentation on this?
Yes, so that relates to the other question. I think the most common scenario is the database is already up and running, and now we found out that database migration is a good thing, and we want to manage our database in a much more sophisticated manner. That's the instance where you want to do a database migration sync or database changelog sync. And they have documented in on the plugin. I think there's a section that tells you that. It's not as explicit, but I think that in the guide I do have a section in there. And the presentation I gave at G3, I did highlight that. So if you have any questions, you can contact me directly. But I can point you that way for now. There's my email. Or you can contact any one of us.
The next question is, can you share some practices for handling deployment to production?
Sure. Any deployment or deployment of these of database changes, I assume. The best way I can share that is to try and mimic your deployment to production in test and locally the way you would do it in production. So if you have an automated deployment with Jenkins or udeploy or something like that, the way I've cut out, I wouldn't say cut out, but I've tried to reduce the risk of different people doing different things, is to automate this. And one of the benefits is, one of the features you can take advantage of is this update on start. I think that's a great way to automate these changes. If you want to be more particular, you can get production access and directly access the database and run these Grails commands. It's more finer grained, but you can do that locally and on test, and then try with the update on start. And if it runs that way and you've got similar environments on, it will run the same way on production.
The next question is, any tips for using this if an app is deployed using Docker with multiple instances running?
With multiple instances. With Docker, you're gonna be in the container, and the update on start will run just the same way, and you'll be able to do that. With multiple instances running, the plugin seems to be able to handle that with the database. Let's see, show table. The database change lock. So that's a locking mechanism where you don't have several things overriding each other. It just puts a 1 in. If I can show you that, so select star. Let's see. Let's describe database change log lock. Okay, it just has a locked. It's just a bit 1 and 0. So when that happens, it will block the other ones. I've done that with, I didn't have a Docker container, but I had 3 or 4 instances with a singular database. And so that single database would be locked. Now, if you have something like Cassandra, multiple databases, several nodes, I'm not sure how that will work. If you have multiple application instances, I know that works pretty easily. How do you handle multi-tenancy with database per tenant? Not sure about that one. Maybe Sergio.
So the next question is, back to the question of production deployments. If we are constrained to only being able to run SQL scripts directly as part of a deploy, what would the process for that be? We would want to run an incremental script based on the state of the production database.
Right. So there's some commands inside the plugin that you can manage the development and the tracking of the plugin, or sorry, of your database changes. And so, for example, the way I'd foresee it is, go to the migrations folder. You could do all this stuff, right? And this stuff would be made the same. You can use this DSL. And if you need to run these per requirement, maybe the company you run, the database people, they're very particular about what they want to do. You can translate these into pure SQL scripts. There's a few commands in the plugin that do that for you. I can't remember exactly what they are, but they are there. I think there's maybe a help. We can go to the docs and look that up, but they translate it to pure SQL. Liquidbase has done this from the start. And what you could do is you could take those, so you have this authority of your changelog scripts, and it's all there. And all you have to do is kind of translate that to what they want in SQL, and then they can run it like that. You don't get the full advantage, but at least you're in control of what you give them, and we're not hacking it live on production. You've done everything, you've organized it, and then you kind of generate the final script for them, and then you give it, and they run it all at once. That's something that I think would be feasible.
So we have another question here. I'm wondering about multiple developers working on the same code base. It seems like there is an increased risk of stepping on each other's toes if these change differences are based on the previously current state. Is the advice here to simply communicate well and not make changes to the same domain concurrently?
That's a good question. I think I think the management of this plugin is is best utilized, or you get the most benefit when you have several developers working. That's the point of it. But on the same domain, just like you're doing same code changes, you'll have conflicts in your code when you commit, and you would have the same thing if you try and deploy it like that. So on similar domains, you'll have to communicate more heavily, just like anything else, right? That's included. But if you're on the context of the full app, it organizes all these things for you. And so, if you're altering one part of the domain and somebody else altering the other part of the domain, and you're actually doing database changes, those will fit in seamlessly and it'll organize it for you, right? The time you'll have to communicate well is if you're both editing the person domain and you're both hitting the same line of code for, maybe both of you guys are putting in an age in there, and you call it age and he calls it, how old you are or whatever. Those things will conflict. But in general, I find that this plugin helps you kind of control and mitigate problems between lots of developers. But your question is based on a current state. The reason why I think it's good is because it manages the state for you. So you know exactly where you are in which state you're in. And so if you do have something stepping over, you can either go before that state or after that state. It would be kind of in chronological order here, or you could check the database change log. So if you run into a problem, you do have routes to take to easily get by that. Whereas in an ad hoc situation, you're kind of you have to recreate the whole thing.
Okay, we are at our hour. I'll go ahead and read one more question, and that is, what are pros and cons of using Groovy changelogs versus standard liquid-based SQL changelogs?
With Groovy changelogs, there are some examples in the documentation where you can add if statements, do conditionals based on certain aspects. I haven't conjured up any that I've used in the past, but it's Groovy, so you can add any type of Groovy statement in there. In XML, you're going with the standard. It's a little bit more kind of wordy, lots of brackets and things like that. It's whatever you're comfortable with. There's not a huge difference. I think just with the Groovy, if you're used to the Grails, I like that part. But I have not utilized, kind of fancy things going on in database changelog. There was an instance where we had a client that was using database changelogs to kind of bootstrap data. So they were bootstrapping data inside of a changelog, which is not appropriate. And we added if statements there to kind of jump over that in the test area or maybe production area. I forgot which. That was one instance, but I think it was being used in the wrong way, and that's why we had to do it. And it wasn't kind of in scope to change that at the time.
Thanks so much, Nirav. So Nirav has posted his email address, if you wouldn't mind flipping back to that slide. His email address is here on the screen. If you would like to follow up with your one-on-one questions, please feel free to do so. And also be sure to visit grailstraining.com, and you'll see a list of all of our upcoming webinar and training workshops. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone.
Thank you, folks. Enjoyed it. Hope you find it good. Thank you.